You might be someone who's gotten more than one mental health diagnosis. Or you've gotten conflicting diagnoses and you're not sure which one is right. Or maybe you've seen someone else say that they have multiple different diagnoses and you're thinking, that can't be right. It has to be one or the other. It can't be all 4, all 5, all even 6. So how do you know what's right? As someone who's received multiple diagnoses, I've been dying to know this question too. It's something that I've thought about very often. When I started getting more and more diagnoses, I did have a thought in the back of my mind, like, one of these has to be true. I can't have every single diagnosis under the sun. So I've been on this journey trying to figure out what makes the most sense, and I figured I'm not the only one in this boat. So today I want to talk about why we have so many different diagnoses, new frameworks that are being considered in the mental health community, and ways that we can continue to dig deeper into our self-awareness. Let's just get right into it. So I thought it would be helpful to start from scratch. Why do we have the DSM, in other words, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders? How did that come about? Is it accurate? Is it the best thing to use? Is there another approach that might be more effective in diagnosing and treating mental health disorders? I want to talk about all of that today. So, first up, why did we create the DSM? The reason the DSM was created was for a few reasons. Number one, it provides a common language that healthcare providers can use in an effort to ensure continuity across those healthcare providers for its patients. Number two, it was developed to create a more uniform and standardized approach to mental disorders, which in turn would provide stronger reliability. In other words, it was created to reduce subjectivity in diagnoses. And number three, you guessed it, it was also created to provide billing codes for insurance purposes, and that's a whole different conversation that we can get into another day. But for the purposes of this video, let's continue. So while I understand the intention of creating the DSM, and I understand that it was in an effort to kind of mimic the medical model that we use in standard and traditional medicine, I think that there's a lot of reasons why it breaks. And when it breaks, that's when we start seeing this comorbidity. For any of you who don't know what comorbidity is, it's a medical term used to describe a person who is diagnosed with multiple disorders simultaneously. Because there seems to be a rise in comorbidity in the mental health space, there's been a ton of research coming out to understand the validity of the DSM and to consider other approaches instead of just using the DSM, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But before we do, I wanted to talk about what I mean when I say the DSM breaks. So first and foremost, there is a massive overlap in symptoms. In the medical model, a cough is typically a sign of a cold or a respiratory illness or some sort of respiratory problem. But in the DSM, take insomnia and difficulty concentrating, for example. Those can be symptoms of depression, generalized anxiety, PTSD, or even ADHD. So because there's so much overlap, the DSM is really counting the same struggle or symptoms in multiple different ways. The second way the DSM breaks is because it tries to use categorical data. In standard medicine, a lot of times you have a simple yes or no. For example, if you have pain and swelling in your arm, and then you go get an x-ray, and it shows a broken bone, the diagnosis is simple. It's either yes, you have a broken bone, or no, you don't have a broken bone. But when we try to apply this same yes-no logic to mental health, it breaks because mental health symptoms are on a spectrum and typically they're often self-reported, so you can't just take an x-ray to confirm the underlying pathology. The problem is that our brains, our experiences, our personality, our responses, our environment, all of the above and all of these factors are so unique and so specific to each individual that it makes it extremely difficult to force people into these boxes that the DSM has created. So between the overlap in symptoms, between the yes and no categorical data, between the lack of concrete testing such as x-rays, the DSM can break, leading to all of these diagnoses that we don't know which one is true and we don't know which one to follow. Next up, we're going to be talking about the different frameworks that are coming forward as more research is being conducted in this space. But before I jump into that, I wanted to share one super interesting fact that I found as I was researching all of this for this video. And it is that two people can both be diagnosed with depression, but only share one symptom in common, which is insane to think about. Because typically when you go to the doctor and you have a broken bone, a lot of your symptoms are the same. But when it comes to mental health, it's completely different. So let's think about it this way. To be diagnosed with depression, the DSM lists 9 possible symptoms. you have to have 5 of those 9 possible symptoms. Because of that structure, when we think of all the different combinations of symptoms that a person can have, there are actually over 200 different combinations of symptoms that a person could have that would meet the criteria for depression. But this raises an even bigger question. If 2 people with the same diagnosis can look completely different, what exactly is the diagnosis describing? How is it helping? To understand that, let's look at some of the new frameworks that researchers are starting to explore. So the first and most interesting framework I found is called HiTOP, or in other words, the Hierarchical Taxonomy of Psychopathology. So while the DSM has a flat list of names and a flat list of disorders that you can have, HiTOP is more like a family tree. So it starts at the top and it organizes them by broader levels, and then it moves into more specific levels as you move down. So first, at the very top, you have the P factor, which is known as someone's vulnerability to mental distress. Think of it like looking at the foundation of a house. So if you have 2 houses in the same neighborhood, and one is having roof problems, and another one is having cracks in the drywall, the DSM would say, okay, you need to send a roofing specialist to the one house, and you need to send a drywall specialist to the other house. But if we consider the P factor, or in other words, the foundation of the houses in the neighborhood, we might see that under the foundation, the soil under the house is really soft and clay, which in turn causes the houses to shift or tilt, which is really causing those roofing and drywall problems. So the P factor is really the vulnerability, or in other words, the foundation. So first you start with the P factor and then you gradually move down this tree. What happens is you would take an assessment that gives you a profile based on your responses. So for example, you might score high on internalizing, and then maybe high for recklessness or overconfidence. And as you move down the tree, you might end up having more individualized symptoms, which is kind of noted at the bottom. But generally, you can see that with this model, you're not just given one diagnosis as you get to the bottom of the tree. It's more so a cluster of diagnoses at the bottom based on the broader buckets at the top. So I left a link down below, but as I was doing research, I found this B-HiTOP assessment, and I wanted to show my results and talk through them a little bit. So before we jump in, I do want to caveat, as you know, I'm not a trained specialist in analyzing these results, so I'm going to keep it very high level and make some assumptions here. So when we look at my results, you can see that I have a very high internalizing score, and then I also have a high disinhibition score, and my P factor is also fairly high. So the way I read this is the internalizing score makes sense to me because I typically experience deep emotional pain like guilt, shame, etc. And then the high disinhibition is where those hypomanic traits that I experience probably start to display themselves. This kind of confirms what I already knew about myself. So what do I really do with that? Well, I work to stabilize my nervous system, and I also work on strategies that help me slow down the brakes during the periods of when my disinhibition is high. In a nutshell, this framework looks at someone's overall profile and then looks at where they fall in the family tree. And then their treatment is really targeted on the vulnerabilities shown in that overall profile. Your symptoms are treated more directly in this model than if you were to just be given a blanket diagnosis. So the other framework that I wanted to talk about was actually mentioned in my previous framework, but I felt like this deserved its own category because we really haven't thought of it like this until recently. So the P factor. Like I said, the P factor model determines someone's vulnerability to mental illness, which means the higher vulnerable you are, the more symptoms you're likely to have. So for those who have a lot of mental health struggles and they struggle really greatly and their P factor is extremely high, they are probably more likely to experience multiple symptoms and multiple disorders, which could also explain the high comorbidity. So when you have someone that scores a really high P factor, you might be seeing multiple diagnoses, and that doesn't mean it's wrong, but it just might mean that they need to target a lot of different areas to see improvement and get the help that they deserve. Okay, so the last one I wanted to talk about today is the symptom networks theory, or in other words, the network theory. So this one is arguably the most anti-medical model framework that we've talked about today, but it makes sense when you really break it down. So the DSM believes that a set of symptoms are equivalent to or equal to a diagnosis. But the network theory believes that all of our symptoms interact with one another, they can trigger one another, they can cause a loop or a spider web of symptoms. So essentially, some symptoms can reinforce others. For example, let's say someone has a very high stress job. So their high levels of stress might cause insomnia. So then they have a symptom of insomnia. And then the insomnia could ultimately cause fatigue, which we know that bad sleep can lead to anxious thoughts and mood deregulation, which can also lead to withdrawal and loneliness, which can probably lead to feelings of deep sadness. So we've started at the top with this extreme stress, and all of those other symptoms kind of trickle down to create this chaotic swarm of symptoms. In the network theory, we wouldn't just call this depression. It would be an interconnected system that needs to be broken down in order to receive the proper treatment. So in this framework, it says that in order to treat the patient, we have to somehow collapse this cycle. And what that looks like is stopping one of the symptoms from triggering the next, which essentially destabilizes the whole system or network of symptoms. So in the example I just gave, we would probably work towards getting better sleep as a start to see what other symptoms might start improving if we start working on our sleep. And that might look like medication for sleep. That might look like mindfulness techniques. But once we can really hone in on the sleep, we'll see if the sleep improves the insomnia and the fatigue, and we'll kind of go from there and adjust as needed. But we'll probably see that a lot of those other symptoms might naturally start to resolve themselves. So as we've talked about today, there are so many different opinions out there on mental health. When you say you have more than one diagnosis, some people raise their eyebrows and they say, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. You can't have 6 diagnoses for the same person. Mental health is not straightforward. I've preached this in my videos before, and I really want to drill down the message that we should be treating the symptoms, not the diagnosis. I know personally I have symptoms that span across multiple different diagnoses, and please, I just ask you to be mindful as you leave comments on what someone's diagnosis could or should or would be, because really you only know a small portion of that person's life, and I think we still need to trust our medical health professionals as we learn more about ourselves and try to find the treatment that works for us. But for now, remember, you're not alone in this. As always, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and until next time, bye!